Good morning and welcome to Physicians for Human Rights Asylum Network webinar about remote psychological evaluations. In light of everything that's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic, Physicians for Human Rights is continuing to do psychological evaluations for asylum seekers, but we are focusing on remote evaluations. So this 1-hour webinar is designed to advise you about some of the challenges, but also the benefits of remote evaluations and how you can, some tips for you and best practices. So my name is Catherine Hampton. I'm the Senior Asylum Officer at Physicians for Human Rights. And we have 3 wonderful panelists for you today. We have Dr. Joanne Ahola, who is a longtime PHR network member and trainer. She received her MD from Stony Brook and completed residency at York Presbyterian Hospital and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. As she was on the voluntary faculty as an assistant clinical professor at Columbia for almost 30 years and was a medical director and adjunct assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the Weill Cornell Center for Human Rights. We also have Dr. Mikhail Dranov, who is a licensed psychologist with a specialty in forensic and clinical psychology. She has a master's in child and adolescent clinical psychology from Montclair State University and a PhD in clinical psychology from Fairleigh Dickinson University. She's the director of the Montclair Center for Psychological Services and an adjunct faculty for the psychology department at Montclair State. She's a member of the Asylum Network at Physicians for Human Rights and a member of the APA Refugee Mental Health Resource Network and of the Immigration Working Group at the APA. She's also an expert trainer for the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, for the Global Institute of Forensic Research, and for Multi-Health Systems, Inc. She has been qualified as an expert witness for the state and federal courts in New York and New Jersey. We also have with us Susan Roy, who is an attorney who graduated from Georgetown Law School, cum laude. She began her legal career as an attorney advisor at the Board of Immigration Appeals, then became Assistant Chief Counsel and National Security Attorney for Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and later an immigration judge in Newark, New Jersey. She served as a moderator or speaker on numerous panels, the National American Immigration Lawyers American Immigration Lawyers Association National Annual Conference Committee. She has testified before the New Jersey State Assembly Judiciary Committee, as well as provided written testimony for congressional and New Jersey hearings, and she's a member of the Roundtable of Former Immigration Judges, who have authorized over 35 amicus curiae briefs in immigration court cases before the Supreme Court, circuit courts, or on certification to the U.S. Attorney General. So they really have a wealth of insights to bring to you. You can also record questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ahola to begin the panel presentations for this webinar.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining with us today. It's such a tragic and terrifying time for everyone. And as I sit here uncharacteristically on a weekday in my Manhattan apartment, what sheltering in place, what I hear are only my refrigerator humming, a few birds, and often the sirens. But it's scarier still now for vulnerable refugees and asylum seekers, some of them with children, some unaccompanied children, LGBT people, people held in detention centers, and now with the courts slowing and closing and the already fraught borders closing, it all seems to worsen by the day. We know in this work that human rights violations are not disappearing, although they might be from the public eye, but in fact they are increasing. We're evaluating asylum seekers in our clinics and offices, and we're now often unable to do this for all of these many reasons, including our own shelter-in-place rules now. It won't surprise us to learn, though, that we can continue to do this work, and well, remotely, whether it's by phone or Skype or FaceTime or WhatsApp, Zoom, any number of platforms. In doing the mental health asylum evaluation, we know that we use the skills and expertise that we use in all of the other parts of our asylum, our professional work, sorry. We just use them more flexibly. To me, it often feels more like jazz improvisation than the classical sonata form I've tended to use in my office. In this historical time, though, we are all working flexibly by necessity, and we see how very much more is possible than we might have thought. FaceTime on my laptop at home is my office now. I respond by text, email, calls. The Times, our patients, and our clients ask this of us, and so do asylum seekers now, wherever they may be. Our attorney colleagues and our own professional colleagues have pioneered this new flexibility of place and format as they've worked at the border and south of the border and in places where there are human rights violations all around the world. Let's honor their work with our own contributions from wherever we may be. I believe that we are very fortunate that the Mount Sinai group undertook their recent study comparing in-person and remote evaluations of asylum seekers. The article from that study you have. I was one of the peer reviewers of it, and I have to say, I almost jumped for joy when I received it. It encourages, it empowers, and it gives us a really helpful, important reference to use in our affidavits. As seasoned asylum evaluators, you may have already done some evaluations using remote technologies. I've done several, and my experience agrees with those described in the Mount Sinai article. They turned out well. One was by three-way conference call with someone in a detention center near the border in Texas, and the interpreter working with the medical interpreter service. For another, we used WhatsApp. We were trying for a three-way video conference. The applicant was someone who was forced to wait south of the border for her hearing. The volunteer interpreter was in another state from where I was. Turns out that WhatsApp video conferencing, at least at that point in time, was only available to be used on a cell phone, couldn't be but it worked that way. However, about 10 minutes in, we had 10 minutes to see what the applicant looked like and get a sense of her emotional tone and so forth. But we found that the visuals were really compromising the audio clarity, and we made a decision to switch to audio only and conducted the rest of the evaluation that way. In both cases, I had observers. I had students, residents, new psychologists, psychiatrists observing and participating from my office. Starting now, students, at least at our clinic, will participate by remote means, say Zoom, until proper restrictions can be in place. In each case, I spent about 3 hours total on the evaluation. I have a few observations from those two cases in particular. I found that it was surprisingly the same to do the evaluation remotely as in person. But I did find that it is somewhat more draining. You know, the work does take a fair amount of energy and can leave you tired afterwards. This way, even more so. And it seemed very clear to me that's because of the heightened concentration that was necessary to be listening that closely when you may not have visuals and you're certainly not in the same place personally. I found that it did move a bit slower. Some of you wrote about some of these issues in your questions to us. Given that there are 3 people in 3 different places and a little extra time for interpretation to go back and forth and maybe clarifications. I did find there was a bit of a silver lining to the added time, however, and that was, as the evaluator, it actually gave me pieces of time in which to think about how it was going and to strategize and to make decisions about where to go and how to spend my valuable time the valuable evaluation time. What I found also was that I didn't have the time that I do in in-person evaluations to cover every single topic or lead as exhaustively as I might ideally like. So to me, it seemed clear that it is therefore even more necessary to have had very clear communication with the attorney ahead of time. So I knew what the key legal issues were, what the key needs were in terms of accomplishments we wanted to attain in the evaluation. I found that it feels every bit as rewarding to do an evaluation that way. I'm pleased that this is work that we can do no matter what our conditions or where we're working from. As always, I let the attorney on each case arrange the interpreter and decide on our technical format and set that up. I did my best to have time before the appointed interview to have a few minutes to speak to just the interpreter, to make that connection and to explain how I'd like to work with them, if possible. But I also found that in each case, one of them in particular, that I allowed for and welcomed a little more intervention and clarification by the interpreter than I generally would in person. I wanted to make sure everything was as clear and as accurate as possible. What I found and what I think now is that we need to use our ears now as our eyes. We have colleagues who are blind who do this 24/7 and exceedingly well. It's perfectly possible. I would say trust that you can do this because you really already do every day. I would say ask gently when you can hear on your phone or see from your app that someone might be crying, that someone's hesitant to discuss something. So hear those hesitations. Don't worry about asking. Better to ask than to assume or to worry or to let it pass by. This is the real-time information that is like gold in our written affidavits and in any court testimony. Listen for nuance. Trust yourself to ask the needed questions. Double check as often as you need to make sure you understood something accurately. It feels every bit as fulfilling to do this work as it does to do it in person. And now we know we can do it from wherever we are and wherever that applicant is. We also know that this kind of volunteer work fills our own cup. It allows us to stay productive doing our piece of the most important work with the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable. I see some questions have come in. And yes, on that first email from Catherine Hampton, you should have gotten the Mount Sinai article. And I think I'll leave the rest of the questions for our next steps. So thank you.
Sorry, my mute was on. Sorry, everyone. So thank you so much to Dr. Ahola for this great presentation and just reminding all of you that you have these amazing clinical skills already, which can also be used in the remote evaluation setting to have that confidence. And just to say that there are great questions coming in through the Q&A and through the chat. Keep them coming. We'll have a question session at the end if for whatever isn't addressed by the upcoming presentations, and everyone will receive a follow-up email which will include various resources, the Mount Sinai study and other resources, and we'll also be circulating a recording of the webinar. And just to briefly mention about the Mount Sinai study for those who haven't read it yet, it's a great study. It compared 10 telephonic asylum evaluations with 20 randomly selected in-person evaluations. And it found that both telephonic and in-person evaluations were equally efficacious over 26 clinically relevant areas in asylum evaluations, including obtaining a history of torture, obtaining psychiatric history, and diagnosis. So clinicians who provided feedback for the study stated that they did not find a difference in their ability to diagnose in comparison with in-person evaluations. But it would be great to have a greater sample size. So actually clinicians who provide remote evaluations for Physicians for Human Rights will receive a survey later, and we'll do a monitoring and evaluation to contribute to our understanding about remote asylum evaluations. So with that, let me hand it over to Dr. Dranoff. And Dr. Dranoff, just let me know. I can put up the PowerPoint and share my screen whenever you're ready.
Catherine. Can you hear me okay? Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time today to participate in this presentation. We're hoping that your dedication, your enthusiasm, your commitment to continuing to provide asylum evaluations throughout this very difficult time in our country and in the world in general remains the same. And I'm happy to share some of my own findings and my own challenges in conducting these evaluations remotely, and hopefully I can answer most of your questions. I'm not sure how to advance to the next slide. Catherine, can you tell me how to go to the next slide, please? Or are you going to do that?
Yes, I'm just sharing my screen right now. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So just let me know whenever you want to go to the next slide, and I'll just go to the next slide.
Okay, perfect. So we can start with the next one. Okay, perfect. Right, so just to give you some general guidelines, just a framework for telehealth, right? It's not a new concept. There's a lot of literature on this. The first studies actually on telehealth go back to the 1950s when there were some services provided remotely in psychiatry. So we know if there is anything good about this crisis happening now, it's that we have a lot to fall back on in terms of resources, in terms of seeking supervision from our colleagues that have done this for a much longer time, securing training from APA. So it's all available to us, but it does require a bit of an effort to bring ourselves up to speed with the differences between in-person and remote evaluations, right? So definitely a basic level of training is required. Today, I'm just going to provide a general framework and some major, basic concepts, but I do encourage you to seek APA endorsed trainings. Now they have a lot of them available because of the crisis that's happening. So definitely look into those if you're not experienced at telehealth already. My number one requirement or recommendation would be that you make sure that your client is a good candidate for telehealth services, right? Not everyone is able to adjust to the changes. Most people are, but technology is a culture of its own, right? It comes with its own language on its own terms and its own challenges, and also not being in the same room with the person that's evaluating you can be a bit unsettling for some of our clients. So make sure that these added challenges, potential obstacles are not getting in the way of you establishing a strong alliance with your client. Make sure that it doesn't raise their level of suspiciousness, right? That healthy cultural paranoia that we sometimes read about in our literature might be heightened when they are not face-to-face with you in an office, but they're seeing you just on a computer screen or a phone screen. So definitely reassure the client that if they feel a bit awkward about this, it's because it is different. There are some changes to take into consideration, right? Reassure them that you are following all the ethical guidelines, clarify your role, just like we do in typical evaluations, right? Clarify your role, clarify that you're not, how you're going to use the information and who you work for and how you are or not associated with other entities that they come in contact with, just to get to that point of connection where they feel open and are ready to proceed with the evaluation. But be mindful of your own level of comfort, right? If this is the first time that you're doing remote evaluations, this will feel a bit different for you because, as I said, it is in many ways. But at the same time, remember that you've provided this service many, many times. And you have a good grasp of using technology, I would assume, and you have the resources that you need. So as long as you put in some time to get a basic level of training and to secure your ethical, secure that you're practicing from an ethical standpoint, then you should be okay. Establishing and maintaining professional boundaries, very important. I would go online. It's a very, very high risk for this turning into a slippery slope towards social media. You might get Facebook invites, you might get LinkedIn videos, right? Just make sure that you explain to your clients that this is a very different kind of platform that you'll be using, and social media is for the people that they socialize with, and what we're doing is not that. It's a professional service, right? When you do remote evaluations, it's very important for your own level of comfort and for the client's level of comfort and for your credibility. If you have to testify on these evaluations, keep your practice. Can we go back to the slide before? Thank you. Keep your practice as similar as possible to your to the way you provide services in person, right? Follow the exact format in terms of obtaining your paperwork from the clients, from the attorney that you work with, establishing connection with the client by phone, conducting your intake, reviewing the paperwork, and then setting up for the evaluation. Right, and of course, make sure that you are aware of your state's licensing board requirements in terms of provision of telehealth. They vary from state to state, so you have to know what does your state approve as telehealth services, and if they have particular guidelines in terms of you requiring training. Sometimes they require that you have 2 hours of training or 6 hours or whatnot to be able to provide this kind of services. I'm going to talk in a little bit about practicing across state lines and international borders, but for now we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So I was talking about assessing fit for telehealth. Not every client or every type of referral is a good candidate for telehealth, right? In the particular case of asylum applicants, we can expect that there will be a certain degree of distress. And most of the time, our clients are stable. They have some resources available, right? Given the current context of a much higher level of stress for everyone, yourself and the client, given the pandemic, you have to be prepared for a much higher level of distress. We have clients here who are being notified from their home countries of family members that have died, and they're unable to attend funeral services. We have clients who are not able to connect with family members back home and are not sure what is happening. And we have clients here who have health issues and are stressed out about health insurance, the cost of going to seek services. They might have family members that are ill, right? So the level of fear, anxiety, and in general mental health issues can be expected to be a bit higher, right? So we want to make sure that our clients are safe when we conduct telehealth services, that we have a plan if we hear that someone is suicidal, homicidal, psychotic, right? If they need immediate intervention, right? So it's a good idea to have, just like you have an emergency plan when you provide services in person, it's a good idea to have that before you engage in remote evaluations. Think this through and figure out a plan. You know, what are you going to do if your client reports suicidal ideation, right? Or if you hear in the home where they're calling you from, or you're seeing them online, if you hear you know, conflict or loud voices, or you see that they have you know, guns around them when you see them online. So it's just good practice to have their emergency contact information, ask them where they are, and ask them how they're doing in general, and then proceed with the evaluation once you see that they're stable and there's no safety risk to anyone in the house or to the client, right? When you conduct remote evaluations, you are subject to the state regulatory board in the state of your licensure and in the state where the client is at the time of service. It doesn't matter if the client is a resident of the same state where you are licensed. If at the time of service they are out of that state, they're visiting family, they're traveling, they're on vacation, they're on a work trip, you have to be aware of the requirements in terms of licensure and providing services of the state where they are at the time of service. So you can, there are some states that have an agreement of provision of services for a limited number of hours across state lines. I think New Jersey and New York have an agreement like that, but it's very limited. I think it maybe 6 hours a month, or maybe a day a month, something like that, right? If you plan to if you plan to provide a service with out-of-state clients for a significant amount of time, you will have to seek a provisional, a temporary license for that state. For example, when I went to Texas last summer to conduct evaluations in one of the detention centers at the border, I had to seek and secure a temporary license for the state of Texas and follow all of their requirements and guidelines in terms of the provision of my services. So you have to know the client's geographical location at the time of service and be mindful of and abide by their state regulatory board guidelines in that state. In your affidavit, you should document the reasons for using telehealth and any changes that you make to your typical protocol. When I write my affidavits, I'm imagining that I will be cross-examined in court, that I will have to testify, even if I might not have to. Some of the referrals from PHR mention that testimony is not required at this time, right? But that means that there is a chance that there might be required later. And in general, it's just good practice to think that you will be questioned, that you will have to explain what is the reason for this client receiving this service remotely. How is my evaluation different? What did I have to change, right, in terms of the typical format of my evaluation? And how might the outcome be impacted by these changes, right? It's good to be proactive about the limitations of this format, rather than not include them in your affidavit and not mention that this happened remotely, and then this information coming out in court when you testify, that will really be detrimental to your credibility, right? So we want to be upfront, we want to explain what was different, why did I use this format, and what might be some limitations of this format. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so just like you do in your typical evaluation, make sure that you have all relevant documents before you meet with your client remotely, right? Secure informed consent. I understand the PHR has a specific process about that, so Catherine can take any questions about that. Emergency contact, like I said, you want to have a phone number for the client, not just their email address where you send them the link for the evaluation, but also a phone number, a second phone number for someone else in their home or neighborhood in case your internet connection drops, or for some reason you lose contact with the client, or if someone needs to assist the client to go to an emergency room or call help or stay with the client until help arrives, you want to have that backup person to be able to get in touch with them, right? It's a good idea to keep that information on your desk near you when you talk to the client, in case you have to make that call. You won't want to go through emails and try to dig it out from a pile of emails. You want to have it handy, right? Make sure the client is able to participate in telehealth, right? Do they have a way of secluding themselves in their room for a significant amount of time, right, without being interrupted? By doing that, are they putting anyone in danger, right? If this is a caregiver for young children, it's unreasonable to ask them to seclude themselves and leave the children in a different room for any amount of time, right? If they're caregivers for a person that's sick, if they have to work online or take calls for work, we want to make sure that they understand that this will be a time when they should be alone in the room for many reasons, right? Confidentiality being one of them, right? For all the reasons that they come alone to a session is the same, unless they have an interpreter, which I will speak about in a little bit, right? We want them to secure childcare if possible, right? If we want them to block their calls from work if they can, or we can conduct, the good thing about working remotely and us all being at home these days, hopefully, we can schedule these evaluations at any point of the day or in the evening, right? You don't want to conduct them at 3 o'clock in the morning, because then you might, that might come up when you testify, and, judges might not really understand why you had to do this at an very unusual time of the day, unless it's an international evaluation where there is a significant time difference, and then you don't have a choice, right? But keep it within hours when people are usually awake and functional and able to participate. If your client is a child, right, you want to, of course, discuss everything with the parents. You want the parents to be comfortable to leave the child in the room with you, depending on the age of the child, exactly how you would do it at your practice in person. Would you meet with this child alone, or would you have a parent in the room? What kind of assent you need from the child, what do you have to explain to the child. It's the same online. Children are sometimes way more proficient to the culture of technology than their parents or than we are. So sometimes they assist parents in getting online and setting up their sessions. We want to make sure that whoever stays in the room is the person that we want to speak with. And we want to make sure that parents are comfortable with us being in the room with the child online, and they're around in case the children become upset. Exactly like I said, as you would do it in person. So again, as long as safety issues are not a concern, as long as they have access to a reliable source of internet and a computer or a smartphone, and they can follow your link that you're sending for the application that you're using, everything should be fine. I'm going to speak about the language barrier in a few minutes when we get to a different slide, so we can advance now to the next one. Thank you. So using tests and measurements, if you've been doing this kind of evaluations for a while, you know that there's no such thing as the perfect assessment, test or measurement, right? Everything comes with pros and cons. Some of them have great psychometric properties, but they've only been normed on US-based participants, right? Some of them have great cultural sensitivity, but they don't have great psychometrics. So you have to use the same judgment in deciding what measures you are using in remote evaluations. as much as possible, use the same measures that you would use if you saw the client in person. Contact the test developers for the test that you're using, and make sure that when you decide and measurements, they come from the developers or of these tests, which should be reputable companies, nothing that pops up overnight that you haven't heard about and now is offering all sorts of online, personality measures and tests, right? Call the developer of the test that you are usually using, and in the majority of situations they have a way to help you conduct these evaluations online, right? Or if it's pencil and paper, you can send the forms to the client, to their house, to their home, to their mailing address, and then wait for them to mail them back to you, or scan and email them through an email that is HIPAA compliant, right? So there are many ways to do that. Stay as close as you can. If you have to change your assessment techniques, make sure that you explain why you use a different test, right? Just discuss the limitations that come with this change, or discuss the benefits that come with using other measures, and then incorporate that in your discussion as you would normally do. Make sure you provide the clients with adequate explanations prior to sending them the links, right? I use a couple of platforms. I use Doxy and I use Simple Practice for my remote evaluations. Both of them are very user-friendly. The only problem is that everything is in English, right? So when I first started doing this, I would send, it gives you the option to invite the client, send a reminder to the client, send a link for them to follow to get into your virtual office, right? I would do that, and then my clients would say, yeah, I didn't get it. I don't know how to do it. I couldn't do it. And a couple of the first cases, they just couldn't, we couldn't meet at a time that we were set up to meet because of this, what turned out to be a miscommunication because of the language barrier. So what I've done now is I had the invitation, the message in this invitation email with the link translated in Spanish and in Arabic, because those are the two languages that are different from English that my clients, also my clients speak. So then I send them that message in their language along with the message in English, right? And then the link. So at least they get the instructions in their language, right? I send them an email that outlines the entire process, right? Number one, I'm going to read all the documentation that I can have access to from your attorney. I will send you at home, right? I have my own consent form, right? I'll send it to you, or I can send it digitally and you can use DocuSign and send it back to me, right? These are the tests that I will use. I would normally use them in my office, but this time we will use them remotely. These are the links. This is what you have to do. And this is how I will get back, they will get back to me. And this is how I will use those findings, right? Reinforce confidentiality, of course, with forensic cases, right, that end up in court, there are limits to confidentiality. They have to know that that the findings of your evaluation will be disclosed with immigration professionals. You might have to testify, that a judge might have access to it. And that technically anyone can sit in immigration court, right? If they might happen to be in the room, they might hear details of their case. But other than that, we are still abiding by confidentiality rules. So it is still very much our responsibility that the entire process is HIPAA compliant, that the privacy and confidentiality requirements of our profession are respected. I've had success adding interpreters on online sessions, video sessions with both the platforms that I use. I've also used phone lines for interpreters. So I would be online in a virtual office with my client, and then I would call from my phone to a phone line, to one of these interpreter phone lines, and use their services that way. It does make it a bit more time consuming. But it's, of course, we couldn't do it. I can't imagine doing it any other way when language is a barrier. So all the paperwork, of course, and the tests have to be in the language of preference to the client, right? When I say language of preference, sometimes you might be surprised by clients when they say, you know, I speak perfect English, but I prefer that everything is done in my native language of, in my case, Romanian, right? Whatever the language the client prefers, you have to follow that preference. Sometimes they say they prefer English because they feel competent enough to be assessed in English. If you're not sure about their English proficiency in reading and writing, there are free tools for assessing English proficiency online. You can access them. They're free, they're easy to use, and they look at both written and spoken English. So just kindly explain to your patient that you want to make sure that they would understand everything, there would not be any information missed because of the language barrier. And it's a pretty quick test. You get the results right away. So you will know if they are able to do the evaluation in English, right? Some of them might be overly confident or not wanting to bother us by asking for an interpreter, right? Or just really right on the border between proficiency and lacking that proficiency, enough of it to take the evaluation. So it's a good idea to make sure that they do have that level of proficiency. We can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So speaking about diagnostic tools, you can happen either at the time of the assessment live, so you can direct them to the link where you have set up a personality test or symptom questionnaires or any kind of behavioral observation forms for their children, or a trauma assessment, or whatever it is that you need them to complete. You can direct them live during the evaluation if you're willing to wait for them to complete it during that time. Or you can send it to them beforehand on paper, mail it to their homes, and then they can mail or fax it back to you. Or send them the link before, and they can complete it before or after the live assessment session. And you can then access the results on the same website. You can use a smartphone or a tablet. Most of the companies offering online assessment tools have apps, and they have very easy, user-friendly platforms. Just make sure that you provide as much information before you direct the client to these assessments as possible. So we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of questions about HIPAA compliance, right? And what platform to use and what are the risks, right? Ethical risks for our practice when we conduct remote evaluations, right? APA actually recommends that we use a HIPAA compatible platform, right? That our practice is HIPAA compatible, which means that whatever platform, whatever tools, whatever instruments we decide to use have to be compatible with HIPAA requirements, right? So what you need to do is make sure that everything that has to do with HIPAA, and there's a lot that falls under that, right? The way you keep your records, the way you protect the confidentiality of your clients, the way you establish, the way your consent form is set up, the way you collect information, everything, every step of your practice, right, has to be following HIPAA requirements, right? So as long as the platform that you're using, the tools that you're using have the ability to be adjusted to meet the requirements of HIPAA, right, for transmission, security, and privacy of the information, then you're fine, right? It's recommended also by APA that we secure a business associate agreement with the company that you're using for telehealth. Some of them have a standard agreement that they're willing to sign with professionals like us. Make sure that that represents the kind of work that you do. If they have this standard agreement, but it's for psychiatrists or social workers, it might not reflect our response, our needs, our requirements in terms of HIPAA. So make sure that it's a good representation of the kind of work that you do when you sign this kind of agreement. If you check out the Office of Civil Rights, they have samples for business associate agreements. And also APA has a lot of resources on this. So reach out to your state chapter of APA if you have questions, or look up on the APA website to find out more about this. I personally had to include an addendum to my consent form to discuss telehealth and how I'm following HIPAA and who is my compliance officer, which in my case, I'm a solo practitioner, so that's me, right? When you have a private practice, you're also the compliance officer, so you have to explain there how you're abiding to HIPAA requirements, just in case there's ever a question, just in case you're ever question, how you have to explain this to your state board. Next slide, please. Is that it? Okay, so I'm happy to, I think that was there another slide?
Oh, no, let's see, stop share. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
No, that was the final slide.
So there's a lot of information that should be considered. I'm happy to take some questions now or at the end, whenever.
We're almost out of time.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yes, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. We are almost out of time, so I'd like to give the floor to our immigration attorney to give us some feedback about how credibility of remote evaluations is viewed, how the adjudicator might be looking at these types of evaluations, what you can be thinking of to kind of put yourself in their shoes. We do have quite a few questions, so keep typing them into the chat. We will record all.
Okay, I'll be quick.
Take down all the questions that have been answered and make sure that they're addressed in the follow-up email. So feel free to continue to send in questions. Just to mention that Physicians for Human Rights is taking care of the informed consent. We've updated our intake process and database, so every single attorney provides consent, obtains consent for their client for a tele-eval before you as a volunteer would ever receive a case. So in terms of consent, if you're doing the case through Physicians for Human Rights, that will be taken care of for you. The other thing just to mention is generally we don't consider that asylum evaluations need to be under HIPAA just because this is a forensic evaluation for use in immigration proceedings. But I think that's extremely helpful information if for institutional reasons or you as a practitioner or for whatever reason you need that information. I think Dr. Dranoff's slide really shows you how you can pursue that. So with that said, let me hand it over to Susan Roy. Thank you so much.
Okay, can you hear me? So I am currently a practitioner, but as Joanne said, I've been a trial attorney and an immigration judge, and so I have a lot of experience dealing with these kinds of evaluations. And my short answer is that yes, online evaluations, if they're conducted with the same sort of protection of privacy and the same sort of objective measures, would be given, generally speaking, as much. Obviously, if you spend 15 minutes with the person online, that would be the same as if you spent 15 minutes with the person in your office, right? You want to be able to get enough of a rapport and enough information with the individual having the evaluation online or in person. I would argue that the same guidelines should apply in terms of setting, right? I mean, one thing to consider is that all detainee cases are handled by televideo now. So, to argue that that's less effective or less credible or less reliable would then, of course, extend to immigration. I see a note that the video is not.
Yes, you might want to turn off your
that
video.
That was happening actually for me when everybody else was speaking. Just turn it off? Okay.
You're breaking up. Yeah,
All right.
that's perfect.
So there you go. I put on my makeup. That's better? Okay. So in any event, you know, I think it's really important to make sure that that you follow the same protocols that you would follow for an in-person evaluation. I mean, I like to recommend to the therapists that I work with, you know, to meet them more than once, if possible, to perform the same objective measures, and to always, of course, make sure that you reach out to the attorney ahead of time so that you know what it is that you're doing the evaluation for. I think Dr. Dranoff mentioned that, and so did Dr. Ahola. You know, there's different evaluations for asylum cases, cancellation of removal, hardship cases, right? So even if you're meeting with the people, you know, by video, you need to know ahead of time what the attorney is looking for, and also what kind of questions will likely be asked of the individual. So in terms of making sure that all of the objective metrics are met, I would make sure to continue to do that ahead of time, just like you would for a live meeting with your clients. In terms of the interpreters, I can't answer the privacy issues as well as the doctors can, but in terms of for immigration attorneys, what I do is if the doctor speaks Spanish, is the primary language that my clients speak, then of course I allow the doctor to arrange for the interpreter. If the doctor or therapist has a Spanish-speaking professional on staff. Otherwise, I arrange for it, and I make sure to use a professional person, usually a member of my own staff. The other thing is, somebody asked a question about notaries. I don't see why a physician's report needs to be notarized. It makes no sense to me, because a notary is only verifying that the signature is true, not that the report is true. And if someone is signing a report other than the physician or the therapist on letterhead, then I would think there would be bigger problems going on than just verifying the signature, right? Because I believe that's a crime. So I don't think that it has to be notarized. You know, here in New Jersey, attorneys are notaries anyway, by definition. So realistically, if you're working with an attorney from New Jersey, I suppose the attorney could notarize it, but I've never done that. Just used letterhead and submit the curriculum vitae for the person. I also think it's very important, if the doctor or therapist is going to be testifying, usually by telephonically as well, done over video. Just to nip that in the bud and explain the reason behind it. The person is low income and couldn't travel to the psychologist's office, or the person is a minor, or the person is disabled, or any variety of reasons, right? So, and then I think that gets over any of the sort of hurdles in terms of credibility. Again, I would recommend, of course, that if you are doing it by televideo, but especially by televideo, you include a description of how you protect it against malingering and things like that, if you're not face-to-face with the individual. But I'm almost out of time, so those are my basic answers to some of the questions that people have about using psychologists who have done televideo work. I myself, from time to time, do use someone who provides online services if the people, you know, for whatever reason, can't get to her office. And it's worked out very well. And her evaluations are very thorough, and she, you know, lists all of the objective measures and the tests that she's done, as well as the conversations she's had. She also reaches out to other family members and secondary sources to support her findings. No judge has ever, you know, questioned the validity of her report, nor has a trial attorney. You know, once we get through the voir dire, if we even have to do it, they've accepted the report for what it is. So those are my basic thoughts on this. And if anyone has any more questions, of course, I can answer them by the chat feature as well. And if you want to reach out to me, you know, separately, that's fine too. I'm sure that the Physicians for Human Rights can provide my email address. And now I'll leave it for a couple of questions. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Yes, we will certainly, that is such a kind offer to let us circulate your email address for further questions. We have got some great questions here, and I see that Dr. Dranoff and Dr. Ahola are answering some in the chat. And as I mentioned, we'll go through them, and if any are outstanding as well, we'll send out a follow-up document. But why don't I just open it up to Dr. Dranoff and Dr. Ahola. Is there something else? We have 4 minutes now left. Are there any other thoughts that you have or questions you would like to answer in the webinar? Dr. Ahola, go ahead.
Hi, just a few points as I listen to Dr. Dranoff. Yes, do please remember these are evaluations, we're not doing treatment. And as she said, very important, I find always to get the backup contact information. Make sure ahead of time you've got a backup cell phone number for the interpreter, for the applicant, just in case and the attorney, just in case glitches come up as you set up your interview, you can be in touch with people and make needed changes. Be patient and flexible with any obstacles that come up. It might take you a little added time to get things into a good groove. Yes, that's all I have to say.
I just wanted to address a little bit the malingering issue, right? So the way we assess malingering when we do in-person evaluations is, of course, our behavioral observations, right? We ask certain questions. Some of us use a specific malingering assessment tool, right? So it's a combination of factors that go into our assessment of potential faking bad, right, for secondary gain. It's the same when we do that online. And I know behavioral observations can be a little bit difficult to secure, right? How do you notice if someone's gait is without problems? How do you know if they smell like alcohol or not, which we can easily see when we see them in person, right? There are ways to go around that, right? If you want to see, if you have concerns that someone is intoxicated, ask them, to point the camera to an opposite corner of the room and ask them to walk back and forth in front of the camera. And you will see at the turning point, they might lose their balance, they might look unsteady, right? You can realize their tone of voice if they're very loud, right? Alcohol is reducing our inhibitions, right? And our voices tend to be loud and we don't realize that. So if you see that they're particularly loud, you ask them to tone, to lower the volume, and it's still very loud, you might have some concerns about that, right? Of course, we always ask in an intake process about substance abuse issues. So you always want to do your homework in terms of their history before we meet them, of psychiatric issues, of substance abuse, certain vulnerabilities that they have, right, that might be exacerbated by their current circumstances. But assessing for malingering, again, we can conduct a good amount of behavioral observations remotely, and we can use our the tools that usually serve this purpose in an online format. I believe there are a couple of them. I can recommend the TOMs that I usually use, but also I think there's a Milan assessment for malingering. I can't remember exactly the acronym for it, but I'm happy to follow up on this question via email. And Catherine, of course, please share my email address if anybody has questions, or if you want to compile all the questions, and then I'm happy to email you back with my answers. Thank you.
Happy
Thank you guys so much. Thank you to our, Dr. Ahola, did you want to say something? We're just at time now, it's 2 p.m.
Feel free to share mine too.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you guys so much for joining us on this webinar. We will send you a follow-up email. I'm going to compile all the questions and ask our panelists to weigh in so we can circulate that to you. We will share the reference for the Mount Sinai study that was mentioned and address all remaining questions. This webinar has been recorded, so we will also circulate this webinar as a link so that you can watch the recording later if you missed the beginning, or share with any of your other colleagues. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much to our panelists. It's wonderful to be part of this community of so many mental health, behavioral health professionals who are dedicated to helping asylum seekers. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.